South Australia has become one of the world's biggest renewable energy success stories. On average, around 70% of its electricity now comes from wind and solar, making it a global case study for what a cleaner power grid could look like. But a few days ago, that same grid faced one of its toughest tests yet. For 4 consecutive days, the wind almost disappeared. Wholesale electricity prices surged to Australia's legal maximum of $20,300 per megawatt hour. Gas stations that had barely been needed suddenly ran around the clock. Electricity began flowing in from neighboring Victoria. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, many of the giant batteries built to support the renewable transition simply couldn't keep up. This wasn't the failure many critics will claim, but it also wasn't the easy success supporters hoped for. Instead, it exposed one of the biggest engineering challenges facing every country trying to build a renewable electricity system. The challenge isn't producing clean electricity anymore. It's producing it when nature decides not to cooperate. South Australia is one of the few places on Earth already living inside that future. Over the past 2 decades, it has steadily replaced coal with massive wind farms and rooftop solar, creating one of the highest shares of renewable electricity anywhere in the world. On some days, the state even produces more renewable electricity than it needs and exports the surplus to neighboring regions. Then the weather changed. Meteorologists call it a wind lull. Engineers often describe it as a wind drought. Whatever name you prefer, the effect was dramatic. Across 4 straight days, nearly 2,800 megawatts of installed wind capacity produced a rolling average of only about 124 megawatts. That's roughly 4.5% of its installed capacity, making it one of the weakest wind events the state has experienced in years. And that's where the real story begins. Most people assume renewable energy succeeds or fails based on how many wind turbines or solar panels you build. But once renewable penetration becomes this high, that's no longer the biggest question. The real question becomes, what happens when an entire weather system refuses to cooperate for days? South Australia already has one answer: batteries. Over the last few years, Australia has invested heavily in large-scale battery storage, including some of the biggest battery installations in the Southern Hemisphere. Their job is simple. When renewable generation is abundant, they charge. When demand spikes in the evening, they discharge electricity back into the grid within seconds. And initially, that's exactly what happened. As prices climbed during the first evening of the wind lull, battery operators discharged heavily into the market, helping stabilize supply while earning revenue from the higher electricity prices. But the event didn't end after sunset. It kept going. The following day, there still wasn't enough wind. Then another day passed, and another. Without large amounts of excess renewable electricity available to recharge them, many batteries simply entered the next evening with far less energy than before. Some operators even chose to recharge using electricity generated primarily by gas, paying extraordinarily high prices because they expected another evening spike might arrive. Others held back their remaining charge, uncertain whether conditions would become even worse. That's a completely different problem than batteries were originally built to solve. Batteries are exceptionally good at shifting electricity over hours. This event lasted days. That distinction matters. It doesn't mean batteries don't work. It means duration matters just as much as capacity. As storage engineers often point out, there is a major difference between balancing the grid through an evening demand peak and balancing it through several consecutive days of unusually weak renewable generation. So what kept the lights on? Several different technologies working together. Gas-fired power stations, many of which had barely been running beforehand, ramped up and operated continuously. Electricity imports increased through interstate transmission links. Grid operators carefully managed available storage while monitoring demand almost hour by hour. The result was something many people won't expect. Despite one of the most severe wind lulls in recent years, the lights never went out. That's an important detail because it's easy to reduce this story to a political argument. It isn't. Even energy experts have warned against that interpretation. One electrical engineer described the event as a stress test rather than a failure, arguing that every power system eventually faces extreme operating conditions. Another analyst noted that South Australia's long-term renewable transition remains remarkably successful, But events like this reveal exactly where future investment still needs to happen. And that's probably the biggest lesson. For years, many debates focused on one question: can renewable energy generate enough electricity? South Australia has largely shown that the answer can be yes. Now the conversation is shifting. Can renewable energy remain reliable during several consecutive days when the weather refuses to cooperate? That's a much harder engineering problem, one that may require not just more batteries, but longer duration storage, stronger interstate transmission, smarter forecasting, flexible demand, and perhaps technologies that haven't yet reached commercial scale. Ironically, this isn't evidence that the renewable transition has failed. It's evidence that countries leading the transition are beginning to encounter challenges the rest of the world hasn't reached yet. South Australia just experienced the future, and the future turned out to be a lot more complicated than simply building more wind turbines.